All right, we are officially recording, so we'll get into it. So again, my name is Brene Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates, which is one of the first domestic violence shelters in the United States. We're located in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were founded about 45 years ago when we also provide prevention education services like these webinars. We have a shelter where we serve about 50 women and children every day with various advocacy programs and support, a 24-hour crisis line, and aftercare and housing support services. You can feel free to explore our website to learn more about our history, programming, resources, and more. And now I'll let Dawn introduce herself and her organization.
I'm Dawn Rudd. I'm the Youth Services Advocate over at Alexandra House, working with teens who are dealing with family, dating, or sexual violence issues. Alexandra House is part of Anoka County. We work with mainly Anoka County up from the St. Francis area all the way down to metropolitan area. So we go from rural to inner city as we do our work. We were founded in 1977. We offer a shelter, a 24-hour crisis line. We do legal advocacy as well as youth and aging services and community education. Our email address is below if you want to explore more about Alexandra House and our services. I'm happy to be here today and to share what I can about my work with youth.
Great, thank you, Dawn. So now that you all know a little bit more about us, we'd love to learn a bit more about you. So in this poll, please select the choice that best describes your role in the community. You can select as many as applies. And if it's not listed, just like with any poll, you can feel free to write your own answer in the chat. And so it'll be helpful for the applied portion of the webinar for us to know a little more about your roles. There was a question in the chat about last week's training, healing from trauma, and so I might put the link to our website in the chat as well. Some people are saying they're case managers. We have a writer as well, a consulting clinician. Great, thank you. We'll give about 10 more seconds for people to submit their votes. Family housing case manager. All right, so I'll go ahead and share the results with you all. So we have about 42% of our attendees are domestic violence advocates, and then 36% are social service providers. We have 14% that said that they wanted to write something else in the chat, as well as 14% said that they're a related advocate, whether that's sexual assault, housing, other things. And then 12% are saying that they're educators or preventionists. So thank you for including that. I'm going to stop sharing the results. And then I will allow Dawn to kick us off with this next slide.
So today, I'm glad that you're all here. I think part of the conversation is just why is it so important to talk about healthy relationships? And I think a big part of the conversation is how do we engage some of the youth that don't feel that it really relates to them. We know, as you see the statistics here, 1.5 million high school students nationwide experience some form of physical abuse from their dating partner. We know that 1 in 3 experience some form of dating abuse, whether it's verbal, physical, emotional, sexual, or even that verbal, that digital abuse or online abuse. So we know that they're experiencing some of it. So many teens don't even realize what to call it or realize that it is abuse. And so helping them understand what's healthy and unhealthy as they're starting these relationships or in the midst of a relationship, I think is really part of the important conversation. And then again, engaging people who are not currently dating as part of that solution as well. What does that look like? If I do get into a relationship, how can I tell if it's healthy or not healthy? So I think there's a lot of important points in order to have those conversations with students. Being able to do it through many different forms, I think helps as well. So being able to engage them in that conversation. Only 33% of teens who are in relationships ever tell anyone. So if we can get other teens to recognize some of the warning signs or red flags as well, and engage them in the conversation, having them be kind of active bystanders as well, you know, questioning or talking to other teens who they're associated with. We know small friend groups often aren't sure, you know, what to say to each other or how to confront each other on these issues. And then one of the big surprises, I think, sometimes is realizing parents don't actually believe that dating violence is really an issue. As you see on this slide, 81% don't even recognize that it would be an issue with their child. And then many don't realize or recognize the signs, even if it was to happen. So I think that it's really important to figure out how we can engage parents in the conversation as well as engaging peers.
There's also a few notes about the normalization of unhealthy or abusive behavior in the media or in TV shows or different things of that nature. And then also about bullying, of how there's been more awareness about bullying and people intervening and wanting to discuss it. But sometimes when it's dating partners, people view it as a private issue and people don't want to get involved. And so that's why sometimes it goes unnoticed or unchecked for so long, because people are a little more hesitant to intervene. And then we also included a link at the bottom about LGBTQ. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, inclusivity, and why that's important when we talk about healthy relationships, because abuse and also healthy relationships can happen in any type of relationship, not just what we often talk about as, you know, a man and a woman in a relationship. It can happen in any kind of relationship as well. So same-sex relationships, queer relationships, etc. So if you want to learn more about that, we included the link on the slide. Oh, I did want to do a quick poll, sorry, before I move on to the next slide, which is kind of about why you personally think it's important to talk about healthy relationships. These answers are a lot longer than some of the other choices in the polls, so it might take you a moment to kind of read through them. And if you have other thoughts of what made you click on this webinar, what made you want to sign up and learn more, you can add that in the chat of why you think it's important, especially if it's not mentioned on any of these poll options. So I'll give you a few more seconds for that as well. Okay, so it seems like the majority of us are kind of writing about how abuse is a learned behavior, that healthy relationships can also be learned, that relationships are intimately connected with health and well-being. We definitely talk about that a lot when we do presentations with physicians, with nurses, and other healthcare providers who definitely see that connection. And then also that relationships significantly impact various facets of life. So it can show up at work. It's not a single issue that kind of remains in the household and doesn't go anywhere else with you. It's something that can really impact a person. Kim in the chat also says, because some do not recognize they're being abused, and it continues the cycle of normalizing the abusive behaviors toward them. Absolutely. So it is important to really, and I think Dawn talked about it earlier, people just assume and just say, oh, I know what a healthy relationship is. Like, we don't have to talk about it. But then, you know, people never really recognize when you break it down, what are the different components, what are the different factors. And then when you do that, sometimes people realize, oh, wow, I've never experienced this before. This is what it's supposed to be like. Amy also wrote, it needs to be recognized in a court of law, very much not recognized unless it's physical. Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing too. If people have a one single story about what unhealthy is, and as long as you're not being physically harmed, it must be healthy. And that's definitely not the case. So thank you for bringing that up, Amy. So I'm sharing the results with everyone so you can kind of take a look at what other people had to say. So I'm really happy that, we're all convinced of these different things of why it's important so we can really get into the conversation today. So I'm going to stop sharing that. All right, so we know a little bit more about why it's important to talk about healthy relationships, but I also wanted to acknowledge why it can be difficult to discuss or engage in healthy relationships. We already mentioned a bit of it in the chat, but especially for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. But some of these bullet points can absolutely apply to people who haven't experienced abuse. There are definitely some very valid reasons as to why establishing and maintaining healthy relationships can be difficult. And some of it can have to do with, trust issues, maybe trauma responses or reactions. It might be really difficult to be in a relationship with someone after experiencing relationship abuse. That is a normal thing to struggle with. Maybe history of harm or shame or invalidation when someone has tried to implement healthy relationship skills, like maybe boundaries. Sometimes people grow up witnessing abuse and believing it's a normal way to engage with others, or maybe not even knowing what they're experiencing is unhealthy or harmful. So I just wanted to name that before we move forward. And then if anyone wants to add more about why it can be difficult, you can feel free to do that as well. But I wanted to acknowledge it's not as easy as, just be healthy, just decide to be in a healthy relationship. There are some barriers that can get in the way of doing that are very real.
I think sometimes in working with survivors, their friends or family also feel that, you're out of it now, so it's fine. Or, you should be happy now, or everything should be okay. Not always realizing that ending an unhealthy relationship can be the most dangerous time, the time where more manipulation goes on, where there's actually danger to the other person. So helping other people realize that ending that relationship doesn't mean it's actually ended yet, or that person is safe yet.
Right. Or that they're unaffected and that it won't come up in other ways too. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Some other people are adding how being in a new relationship can bring back different triggers. And then same thing Anna is reiterating, just because the relationship ends does not mean the violence ends. And that there's trauma bonding in all its forms. So that might be something that can get in the way of experiencing a healthy relationship too. Thank you for adding that, everyone. So that's very related and segues us to the next slide about tips on rebuilding and maintaining support after the isolation of abuse.
So I think a big part of once teens are in unhealthy or abusive relationships and they end them is trying to reconnect with friends who they may have pushed aside, someone their dating partner didn't like, or just they were spending all their time with their dating partner and not spending time with any friends anymore. So some friends may be open to reconnecting. Others may have said, no, we're done. This is cut off now. So it really is trying to make those connections with people, explain maybe where you were at or what you were dealing with. But also part of it is trying to build new relationships. Because sometimes your dating partner is part of your friend group. And if you continue with that friend group, sometimes that makes it difficult to end that relationship in a healthy way. So it is sometimes trying to look out for new things, new activities. It talks about like, how can you, throw a party, get together, join different things, try and put yourself out there, which is very scary. It's not just easily done. But realizing that if someone wants to move forward, kind of meeting them where they're at and helping them set some goals, or trying new things, trying to reach out. Part of it is also sometimes they can go to the other end of the spectrum in, okay, now I'm not with this person, so I can do anything I want. And sometimes they're not always making healthy choices. So it's helping them to kind of realize what do I want in my next relationship? What do I want for myself? And kind of helping them figure that out along the way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition, like rebuilding trust and dealing with shame is a really big thing too. In the last slide, I didn't mention it, but it kind of talked about how sometimes survivors have been convinced, especially if they've been in an unhealthy or harmful relationship for a long time, that they're not worthy of being in a healthy relationship, or that they don't deserve it, or they wouldn't even know how to be in that, like accept kindness from another person, because someone has broken down their self-worth and their self-esteem for so long that they just don't even think it's worth it, or they've been explicitly told, no one's going to love you the way that I do. And so those things aren't just words, they become something that another person really takes on and feels is truth. So being able to have support and working through those different feelings of why did I stay so long, or maybe it was all my fault, all the different shame and different thoughts that come up. Having that support system can be really, really important, and feeling connected to other people who really do value, cherish, and care about them from a place that isn't rooted in power and control. Okay. So I do also want to mention how, like, as we talk about relationships throughout this webinar, we thought it would be important to mention that we're not always exclusively talking about intimate relationships, especially when we talk to students in schools. Not everyone may be or have ever been in a dating relationship. So healthy relationships can also refer to friends, family members, coworkers, and even yourself, how you treat yourself. Relationships are made up of actions, thoughts, words, respect, communication, boundaries, experiences. All of these things can happen in a variety of different kinds of people in someone's life. We'll discuss mostly about intimate relationships, a little bit about relationship with yourself and with your family, but know that the majority of these pillars or ideas and things that we discuss can absolutely be applied to all the different spheres in someone's life.
So we're going to talk, I think we have a poll. Are we going to do that first?
I think that's just a tool. It's just supplementing what you're going to say.
Sorry, I apologize for that. So kind of we're going to work with a few pieces that are off of the Love is Respect website. It's the relationship spectrum. And I think this is where it comes in with talking with youth about what unhealthy looks like, what healthy looks like, and what abusive looks like. And one of the things that I often do with this tool, and that my coworkers do with this tool, is that we have broken it down where we take the unhealthy characteristics, the healthy and the abusive, and then we give it to the youth, and we let them decide what's healthy, what's unhealthy, and what's abusive. You can put it up on a big whiteboard and have them put those pieces up there. You could do it just on a table with an individual or a support group. But allowing the youth to take those characteristics and talk about why that characteristic is healthy or why that characteristic could be seen as unhealthy is really important. Rather than us as adults coming in and saying, this is healthy and this is unhealthy, it's really important to hear the youth voices as they have those conversations. So like in the unhealthy part, they may put down the pieces like breaks in communication or pressure or dishonesty, the struggle for control. There's a lot of other pieces that can go in there, but we also realize, and if you want to flip to the next slide, that some of those can meet a couple of different areas. So we've got abusive here with accusations and blaming, isolation and manipulation. Sometimes they don't always see that as abusive. They may see manipulation as, more of unhealthy but not abusive. So we give them the opportunity to put these in different categories that could be in the middle of two. If you flip to the next slide, we talk about things like the healthy aspects. And some people could say, pressure from when they said unhealthy pressure. Well, pressure to quit drinking could be healthy. Encouraging your partner not to continue, some of their behaviors could be healthy. So part of it is listening to them have the conversation around what's healthy, what's unhealthy, and what's abusive. I think really works well talking with teens. And this is a good one, not just in teens who are in relationships, but really you can engage an entire classroom and have them have this conversation I had a health teacher who told me, this is the first time I've actually heard some of my students actually participate. They took that characteristic word, they walk up to the board, they told us why they thought it should go in a certain section, they had an explanation for it. So they actually got to use their voice and say why they thought this. So even students who aren't in relationships can still feel a part of, what does this look like? And it really helps them realize what's out there, whether they're thinking about relationships that they may have been in the past, whether they're thinking about relationships they're currently in, or they're looking at relationships that may be part of their family, or relationships that their friends are in. And so how can I help through that conversation? So I think an activity like the relationship spectrum is one that's really good to use, again, in many forms, whether it's with a large group, whether it's individually, or whether it's in like a support group setting. It gives a lot of good conversation and discussion.
Yeah, another really great pro of activities like these is what was mentioned earlier about how abuse is often seen as just physical. And this activity can help broaden the different aspects, because not a lot of these don't talk about, physical. It's other unhealthy or abusive behaviors too. So it helps people really kind of open their eyes of like, oh wait, there's also emotional, there's verbal, there's sexual, there's digital, there's all these other different forms as well. We do have a question from Jadelyn about how does this work with teens or just others in general from different cultures? If they were to see unhealthy characteristics considered okay and possibly even healthy in a relationship.
Great question. I think that part of that is they get to use their voices as they're sharing why they think something is healthy or unhealthy. And so if they bring up different aspects, we allow them, when they put the words on the board, we don't change where they place them. We allow them to place them where it fits for what they think is okay. And then we may have conversations around how something could be seen healthy in one way or unhealthy in another way. And so we really try and be respectful to where someone places something, or where it fits in their value system.
Yeah, I absolutely think context is essential during this. And I really like what you said about allowing them to direct and guide kind of where they're conceptualizing all these different characteristics. Another very similar activity that I've done in high schools is called like Go Fish, like healthy relationship Go Fish. So similarly to these different characteristics, there's more like scenarios. And there's different scenarios or different actions or different things that are said that are printed out on cards, and everyone gets 7 cards. And the goal is to have all 7 cards describe healthy relationships or something that you would want in your relationship. And in order to discard something that you don't like, you have to explain why you're discarding it. And then at the end, you explain why all 7 are things that you would look for in a relationship. And the first time I did it, it was really amazing to see how some of the students who were really shy at the beginning and didn't really want to say anything, toward the end, they were like, no, I disagree with you, or like, how could you think that that's okay? Or they'll say the most vulnerable they get is when they explain the healthy things. And they say, I actually really like it, when someone thinks about my interests or thinks about the things that I really like to do, and is considerate of that and doesn't make fun of me for liking certain things. Or like, it's really cool when there's friends in the classroom and they say, wow, I didn't know that about you, or oh, I didn't know that this is something that you would really like, and you can kind of see a deeper connection being made, and that they might continue to discuss these things outside of the classroom too. But kind of relating it back to the question is absolutely, like Dawn said, taking into consideration the culture, but also, opening up the dialogue of kind of asking them questions of, how does that make you feel when things like that are so prominent in your culture or in your household or in your family? And they might say, it really sucks. I really don't like it. I wish that this wasn't something that everyone in my culture seems to have accepted, or some people, disagree with it, but they don't publicly say anything about it. So I think they have most of the answers. And so it's not our jobs to sit there and say, your culture is wrong, or your culture is bad or good or whatever. It's more so to kind of just support them in that and allow them to take reign. So hopefully that answers your question, and you can let us know if you have any follow-up from that.
It's interesting. We have some students who will, we have lots of conversation around boundaries versus rules, oftentimes during the spectrum activity, and talking about how boundaries are something you set up for yourself and rules are something you tell someone else, you know, that they have to abide by. So there's oftentimes a large conversation around, you know, how do you have that conversation about boundaries within a relationship, and, you know, helping them kind of understand what that looks like, rather than setting rules like you can't talk to this person or you can't talk to this person, or you must get them off of your social media. Another one that comes up with lots of conversation is one of our characteristics is talk about sex. And so we end up having a pretty large conversation about what that could look like. And that runs into the boundary conversation, about being able to set boundaries and having conversations that are healthy around sex or sexual activity, or what you may or may not want to do, versus someone who is constantly talking about it, brings it up every time you see them, pushes your boundaries all of the time. So again, depending upon where that student puts it on the spectrum, is kind of the conversation starts from there and then broadens out.
Yeah. We have one last comment before we move on to the next slide from Wendia. They say, true, though at times those good encouragement would then be gaslighted to the people who suggest improvement as being too much in control and pushing too hard. Guess it's just quite impossible changing a person's concept of what doesn't fit in their value system. Yeah, again, that's definitely not our role to say you need to embody these things and this needs to be your value system. It's more so providing these tools, this information, and saying, you know, kind of do integrate that into your individual life as much as you would like. And the goal isn't always to, you know, immediately drastically change everyone's mind about everything. More so just present that information, and sometimes later down the line they think about it a little more and it becomes more relevant in their life. So definitely acknowledging how someone saying, oh, that's unhealthy or whatever, can sometimes be used to gaslight someone is really important. But again, yeah, we're not in the business of changing anyone's mind or convincing them of one thing or another, just providing them more information and being available to discuss and talk it through. So thank you for adding that. Okay. So Dawn just described the different levels of the relationship spectrum and kicked off the healthy relationship realm in the last slide. So we really start to get into the different components. So most people can name basic aspects of a healthy relationship, and it seems really simple. But if it were that straightforward and easy, wouldn't everyone be engaging in healthy relationships flawlessly, right? So when we start to break down what a healthy relationship is, that's when the real work can start. When we talk about domestic violence, the power and control wheel is often used to help people, you know, visualize and see different tactics and components of abuse. And that wheel has been adapted and aims to provide an alternative to the power and control wheel, and is thus dubbed the equality wheel. So I linked the URL to this wheel if you want to view it in larger. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen right now. Or if you'd like to print it out and use it with anyone that you work with. So most people know what these terms mean, maybe in isolation, but experiencing them, feeling them, practicing them, that can be an entirely different ballgame. So healthy relationships are supportive and they encourage you to succeed. They build you up rather than breaking you down. Healthy partners and friends encourage you to reach your goals while maintaining independence outside of the relationship. This can be your partners or friends assist you with studying for a stressful exam, or offer a listening ear, or give you additional space during a particularly tough week. And then some other things about that you'll see on this wheel about healthy partners. They respect your boundaries, understand that your boundaries are your own, and they may look different than theirs. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next few slides about boundaries, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But again, supporting the goals, encouraging you to maintain your independence, trusting you, and again, we're going to break down trust too. And then one last thing I want to mention before we kind of move on is consent. So consent is a really, really important aspect of healthy relationship. Many people think that consent is only a conversation that you need to have with a stranger or someone you don't know as well, but consent is absolutely necessary in relationships. Consent means a lot of different things, and we'll talk about it here. It means in a relationship that allows both partners to express what they do want to experience. So again, that saying that a lot of us hear about consent is yes means yes. It's empowering and useful to think about what consent is. It's not the absence of a no. It's not doing something because you feel like you have no other choice. And again, consent is ongoing, so both partners should be giving and looking for consent. Just because they've been given consent for an act before doesn't mean that it's a given every single time. This idea also relates to new relationships. Just because you're giving consent to something in a different relationship doesn't make it automatic in a new relationship, right? It's a different person. And then consent is not a free pass also. So saying yes to one thing doesn't mean you're giving consent to another thing. There's a really great video called Consent Tea. I'll link it on the screen as well if you want to use that to kind of talk about consent. I think it makes more sense to people when they see it in that way. So I'll include that link too.
The Consent Tea video is really awesome. It gives a kind of a non-threatening way to talk about consent. And adds a little bit of humor on a topic that can be really sometimes touchy as you're doing the presentation. I would bring up the equality wheel and power and control wheels. We use a lot with individuals or support groups. There's so many different variety of those wheels online that you can actually, specifically put them to a certain kind of group or a certain age. We oftentimes will cut all the pieces up and have kids decide which wheel it goes to and why it goes there. It's another great way to have a conversation around what looks healthy and equal and what looks unhealthy and potentially abusive. So they're great tools to use with individuals or with classrooms.
Absolutely. I think that's another way to talk about culture, because they do have some culturally specific wheels as well. So it might be another tool, again, not to just tell someone this is healthy, this is unhealthy, but just something to engage in a dialogue. And then just a few more things about consent. So the relationship status doesn't make consent automatic. There's no such thing as implied consent. And it's not consent if that person is afraid to say no. And that non-consent means to stop. So I think all of these things are really important because sexual abuse and sexual coercion is very common in relationships, but it's sometimes not taken as seriously as when it's caused by a stranger or someone that they don't know. So that's something that we just wanted to mention as well. Okay. So I'm interested to see how many people have heard of braving before. I'm going to launch this poll to ask, when you read through these different components, this is a tool to use to describe trust. So I'm wondering if there's a particular component that stands out to you that you'd like to learn more about or have a discussion about that maybe you've never heard. Sarah says, I love Brene Brown's work on trust. I do too, and that will become very evident throughout this next slide. But if some things are foreign or some things are like, I know what this means by definition, but I don't know how it applies to trust, that would be a great opportunity to kind of add it in the poll. So give it a few more seconds. Lots of love for Brene Brown in the chat. She's amazing. Yep. Provides a lot of different tools for us to define things. All right, so it seems like a lot of us want to know more about the vault, and then boundaries, and then potentially accountability, and then the rest are kind of tied. Anna also mentions it's not consent if the person is under the influence of a substance, asleep, or passed out. Yeah, that's absolutely really important as well. I'll leave it at that. That's really important. Okay. So I'm going to share the results of what other people said, just so you all are aware of that. So we will talk about boundaries in greater detail, but again, just a little overview of this. Boundaries is very simply put what is okay versus what's not okay. And kind of saying, I trust you if you're clear about your boundaries and you hold them, and you're clear about my boundaries and you respect them. So again, kind of broadly speaking, trust is something I really want to highlight with healthy relationships. It's often a quality we all seek in anyone that we encounter or spend a significant amount of time with. We want to trust them and we want to be trusted. So oftentimes when someone is abused or harmed or hurt, they may say things like, I can't trust myself anymore, or they tell someone else, I can't trust you. And sometimes those conversations aren't as productive as maybe they could be because they can't explain what that means. Some people might see, what does it mean you can't trust me, or what specifically can you not trust me about? So kind of what does it mean to trust someone? So this model, created by Brene Brown, a researcher and professor of vulnerability, shame, and many other topics, defines trust as braving, so an acronym that stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, the vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And so we'll kind of talk about boundaries in a moment here. We'll get to reliability. So again, you do what you say you're going to do. So that's kind of the more brief, and I'll get into some of the other ones that people voted for in a moment here, but just kind of lay them all out so we all know. Again, accountability. I can only trust you if when you make a mistake, you're willing to own it, apologize for it, and make amends. And then the vault, which was the highest rated one, and some people are very confused, they're not sure what that is. And so this is described as, what I share with you, you will hold in confidence. Also, you do not share things with me that are not yours to share, because then my trust in you is diminished. So a little bit more about the vault is that it really does kind of talk about when the vault is violated, I often think about emotional abuse. And some different tenets about emotional abuse, especially with parents, they might disclose something really embarrassing or shameful about their child, to a friend or to the child's friend. It embarrasses them, and it was just information that they shouldn't have shared with someone else, and it was with the intent of, causing harm. So that is a violation of the vault. And so it shouldn't be used with manipulative or harmful intent or control to, isolate someone. So the vault can be used in a negative way of like, oh, we're in a relationship, I don't want you to tell anyone about something hurtful that I said or something hurtful that I did. That's not a healthy way of, engaging with the vault. The vault is more so, with the intention of not harming someone and trying to keep certain things between that that they hold in confidence. So hopefully that makes sense about the vault and about trust. And that's something when I've done kind of these activities with moms, some of the moms will say, I really didn't want, my partner to say certain things to my child, and they, violated my trust because of, and they're like, now I kind of understand what the vault means of like, I thought that I could trust this person, and they kind of went behind my back and, did something that I didn't agree with, or told them explicitly not to tell my child. So that's another way that it can come up as well. And if anyone can think of any other examples, you can add it in the chat too. So then the next one is integrity. So choosing courage over comfort, choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy, and practicing your values, not just professing your values. That's something that comes up a lot with trust, especially when trust is broken, or that a mistake is made, or especially in instances of even like cheating, having their integrity come into question, of saying, oh, I really value loyalty, I really value respect, but you're not practicing integrity unless you're actually doing those things and not just saying, oh, I have these values. So that's an example of that as well. And then non-judgment is, I can fall apart, ask for help, and be in struggle without being judged by you. And you can do the same with me. If you cannot ask for help, then, and they cannot reciprocate, that is not a trusting relationship. So real trust doesn't exist unless help is reciprocal and non-judgment. So again, you can still hold someone accountable for their actions without shaming, blaming, or judging them as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, generosity. So our relationship is only trusting if you can assume the most generous thing about my words, actions, and behaviors, and then check in with me. That's something that is really difficult, I find, for sometimes for survivors, because they've kind of been conditioned over time to not do that, to just assume that the person has malicious intent or has bad things in mind and that they need to look out for themselves. But when you are really in a trusting and healthy relationship, you're able to make those generous assumptions, not blindly, but just be able to go back and check in with them and say, hey, I'm going to assume you didn't mean to hurt my feelings, but I just wanted to check in with you, of like what your intentions were, or just follow up on that as well. So that's a little bit more about braving. And an activity that I've done with some clients before is writing out all of these components on a piece of paper. So boundaries, reliability, all of that. Writing the name of the specific person that they want to improve or explore their relationship with, and then collaborating with the client to rank each of the components, with 1 being the component that they feel the best about, and 7 being the component that needs the most work. And then we go through each letter, so B for boundaries, and discuss the current situation. So are there boundaries in the relationship? What type of boundaries are there? Are there times that boundaries have been crossed? Do new boundaries need to be implemented? Does the client know what the other person's boundaries are? And then after exploring that a little bit more, we make a small table with their name and the other person's name on the other side, and write down questions and actions and ideas, etc., that are related to boundaries. So this can help provide actionable ideas to help improve the relationship or acknowledge how things can be different. And this can also be a tool to help outline how to restore trust once it's been broken as well too. So let me know if you have any additional questions or if that didn't make any sense. But I'm not seeing any, so we'll move on. And if you have anything to add, Dawn, you can definitely feel free to jump in at any time. So this is some more information about boundaries. We'll discuss them a little bit more in depth. So establishing and maintaining boundaries, I would say, can be difficult for anyone, but especially for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. There are a ton of worksheets from Therapist Aid that I linked on the screen that really dive into boundary exploration, discuss the different types of boundaries, how to implement that boundary, and even specific things to say. So this first kind of visual that I added is about the common traits of the 3 different types of boundaries, which are rigid, porous, and healthy boundaries. So rigid can be things like very protective, very avoidant, unlikely to ask for help. So those are rigid ones. Porous are more about like oversharing or having difficulty saying no, or they're dependent on the opinions of other people, or they fear rejection if they don't comply with other people. So those are examples of porous. And then healthy would be, valuing their own opinions, accepting when others say no to them, knowing their personal values and needs and how to communicate them. So those are kind of different examples of that. And then next, what you can do once you kind of understand porous, rigid, and healthy, you can start to map out and explore what are the different boundaries that someone might have when it comes to physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, material, time. There's also a few others that aren't mentioned on here, like even financial, or kind of like social media, digital boundaries as well, social. So those 2, digital and social, are also very, very relevant during the times of COVID. So these can be helpful worksheets to use in support groups, programming, individual advocacy, etc. So kind of exploring those things can be helpful. And then sometimes people want more guidance on like, how do I actually implement a boundary? Like, I've never done that before, or it feels really uncomfortable to tell someone that I don't like something or I don't want them to do something. So it gives some prompts of, I'm not comfortable with this, or I don't want to do that, or decided not to. And then other things about like being respectful, compromising, using confident body language, other tools about that. And then they also have some good like healthy boundary tips about things, especially if they haven't engaged in healthy boundary setting. That can be really helpful. So all those links are available there on this screen. And then last week during our healing panel, Dorothy, a mental health provider, mentioned how role-playing is a way to practice setting healthy boundaries, particularly scenarios where that person may not be as receptive. So she found that one of the best ways is to say, okay, think of something that say you want to set a boundary with your mom. Tell me something that your mom would typically say if you're trying to set a boundary that would get in the way. And then they kind of role play, and Dorothy would say the thing that the mom would say, and then they kind of get more used to what would it feel like to be able to express this to them. So that's something that you can do with your clients too, is kind of role playing those boundaries of, I know a lot of advocates often do it with like abusers, of like if your abuser, you know, tries to manipulate you or tries to convince you to do certain thing that you don't want to do, let's practice being able to, you know, even say those things out loud, even if it's not directly to that person in the role-playing scenario. So hopefully these boundary tips are helpful. Dawn, is there anything you want to add about boundaries here?
No, I think you did a really good job. It's, you know, just having the conversations and helping them realize boundaries and rules are different, helps them and empowers them,
Right.
you know, to be able to have these conversations.
Because boundaries can feel like control sometimes if you have been in an abusive relationship. Absolutely. And you don't want to emulate someone who has harmed you, for sure. And then being able to apply that braving framework to yourself. So kind of talking about how, you know, we can't necessarily control as much as some other people may try to control others. We can only really control ourselves. So how can we develop a greater sense of trust with ourselves? And how can we treat ourselves in a way that's more aligned with what our values are? And so these are some questions to explore about certain events or certain things that have happened. You can ask yourself, you know, did I stay in my integrity? Was I reliable? Can I count on myself? Did I honor my own boundaries? Sometimes the ultimate betrayal is when you break your own trust, or when you feel like you can't trust yourself anymore. So going back to the model can help you identify points and brainstorm ways to restore that trust in yourself. So that's kind of the last moment that we will kind of talk about that. And then we'll quickly talk about vulnerability and connection as well. So again, borrowing from Brene Brown, these two definitions. So vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never a weakness. So I think sometimes even in this field, we associate vulnerability with something negative of like, oh, it's a vulnerable population, or oh, it's someone has some kind of weakness or vulnerability or something that sets them as a disadvantage. But when we talk about vulnerability in the context of like healthy relationships, sometimes someone who refuses to be vulnerable, it can be really difficult to have a relationship with them or to be able to engage in different things. So these are some examples of different ways to be vulnerable, and some of the number one ways of doing that is having that self-awareness. So sometimes it's difficult to ask for what you need if you don't know what you need. So being able to have that self-awareness can be a really helpful starting point. And being able to express what you really think. That can be a vulnerable situation, especially for someone who has been ridiculed or emotionally abused if they do express what they really think about something. So that can be something that is challenging for someone who is engaging in a healthy relationship in a new time or a different time. And then additionally, connection. So connection can be defined as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. So sometimes when we read this definition, some people say, oh, absolutely, I know who I have a connection with, and then I know other people who I that's not present. And then it kind of talks about the 4 keys to connection, which you can learn more about at the link that I added. I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to make sure we have time for questions. But at the bottom, there's this really cool card game, and it's a YouTube channel. It's called like The Skin Deep. It's called The and they have really vulnerable and connection, you know, conversations with a bunch of different people, but it is primarily like either exes or people in long-term relationships or different things like that. And they created different card games. So they have card games for coworkers. They have a card game for yourself, with different prompts and different questions as well, to be able to explore and, be vulnerable and have a deeper sense of connection with other people in your life. They have one for families. They have one for friends, for when you're dating, for long-term relationships. There's also another mentioned in the chat of We're Not Really Strangers is another really great platform for that as well. So there's a lot of fun, modern day activities to be able to talk about these things in a way that's not like, oh, hey, let's sit down and like look through this PowerPoint. Something that's a little more informal, but still very impactful. So that's something I definitely recommend. It looks like we have a question. Are these PowerPoint slides available? Yes, we will email them out. You will get all the PowerPoint slides, I promise. Okay, so moving on to healthy communication strategies. So you've probably heard the phrase, open communication is the key to a healthy relationship. And that not being able to communicate openly, honestly, and effectively can be the root cause of the barriers that prevent people from engaging in healthy relationships. So these are kind of different strategies that we've already talked about, so I won't spend too much time on that. But something specifically about communication, being able to find the right time, being able to talk face to face, which with right now in the age of COVID, I know we have a lot of people who are, having to do long distance for the first time, or having to not be, if they don't live in the same household, having restrictions on like when they can be able to see each other or how they see each other. So we do have FaceTime, so that's another way to kind of not talk in person, but kind of still see their face and be able to maybe avoid other miscommunications that could happen over the phone or through text. And trying to use, I or we, so saying things like, I feel that we haven't been as close lately, instead of you have been distant with me. So kind of using language that's not really attacking another person, but kind of just expressing how you're feeling. Being honest, admitting that you aren't always perfect and apologizing when you do make a mistake instead of making excuses. And you'll feel better with that, and it'll help strengthen your relationship. And then checking your body language. Sometimes that can be the root of some arguments of people saying, when I was talking to you, you weren't looking at me, or you weren't listening, or you were on the phone, or you were looking down at your phone and you're distracted when I was trying to have a serious conversation with you. So being aware of your body language can be helpful too. And then sometimes people benefit from a 48-hour rule if their partner does something that makes them angry. It's definitely important to talk about it, but sometimes, taking some time to process what you really feel can be helpful for reacting in a healthy way. So if you still feel hurt or upset after that period of time, definitely consider bringing it up. But that's a case-by-case scenario, and context is really important for that as well. There's a question about, in your work and experience with these topics, do you all believe that communication is easy? How do we break through the fear or anxiety that people have about healthy communication? I do want to answer that right away. Dawn, do you have any thoughts?
I just think part of it is, kids model what they see. And so oftentimes they're communicating in ways that they grew up with. They're watching how conflict is resolved with people in their homes. So sometimes teaching new communication strategies can be kind of scary. So a lot of it is, I think, role modeling, helping them with scenarios like you were talking about earlier when the boundary conversation, because I think just telling them what makes it healthy is not as helpful as helping them practice those conversation and communication strategies.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the number one way to face the fear head on, of like, let's practice if you feel safe with me as an advocate or whatever role I'm in, to be able to experience the healthy communication. So something that when I was talking to, like during the healing panel last week, about being able to experience the things that you want. So even practicing it with yourself can be helpful, so it doesn't feel as foreign when other people are offering it to you. So if you, practice healthy communication yourself when other people communicate in a healthy way toward you, it doesn't feel as foreign or different because you've experienced it before. Your body can recognize it like, oh, this is a familiar thing. So I definitely don't think that, communication's easy. There are definitely classes on it, and I think they should be required in schools. That's a whole other conversation. But I do think that breaking through the fear is being able to just have them experience it, and go from there. So hopefully that answers your question. You can let us know if you have any follow-up questions with that, but that's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Okay, so we're going to briefly talk about how to communicate if you're angry. So again, with that, is communication easy? Yeah, it's easy if someone is, a stellar communicator, if they know how to express their feelings, if they know how to be really honest and be very kind and compassionate. But that's not always the case for everyone. Sometimes it can be really scary to, say, oh, I don't want this person to think I'm mad at them, but they did do something that kind of upset me. So one thing that I want to ask in this next poll is, when you're working with clients, or you can replace that word with anyone else, whether that's, someone that you're working with, frequently report what goal when engaging in an argument. So that's one thing that we talk about of being really important when you're communicating with someone when you're angry, is like, what is the goal of the conversation? What is your ideal outcome? What do you want to get out of this conversation? Because sometimes people automatically just react to things and they're hurt, so they want to make the other person feel hurt. Or other times, if they really kind of sit down with themselves and think about it more, they realize, I really just want an apology, or I really just want to know that I'm loved and that I'm cared about, despite what happened. But that's vulnerable. So sometimes people hide behind the mask of like, oh, I want that person to feel the way I felt, or I want that person to feel really bad about what they did. But really what they want is that connection. They want to feel like they belong. Or maybe, they just want an apology too. So I'll give you a couple seconds for you to vote. Amanda wrote, to be right. Yeah, some people absolutely are saying, I'm the one that's not at fault in this conversation, and I want you to tell me that, I'm right. And so that can absolutely be a goal as well. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share it with you all. So one of the number one things is to feel seen and heard. Absolutely. So sometimes it's not like, I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to see me, and I want you to hear what I have to say. And then there's some others about, I want to resolve the problem. Others saying, I want to make sure that the person knows that they were hurt by what they did. So being able to understand what that goal is can be important, because that's one of the tips here of, after stopping, taking a break, maybe breathing, and helping decide what you want to do next. And then the next step of thinking. So after, the emotion isn't as raw, thinking about what really made you upset. What was the root of the issue? Was it how your partner spoke, or something that they did? Figure out the real problem, and then think about how to explain those feelings. And then again, talk, and then listen. So after you tell your partner how you feel, remember to stop talking and listen to what they have to say. Some other tips, again, are like setting expectations or guidelines before discussing the conflict. So I know I've had people say, I would really love it if you don't call me this name. Like, it's just not going to be effective if you start insulting me or criticizing me or saying these things. It's going to set the conversation off track. We'll talk about what the ideal outcomes are, see if there's a compromise or what a resolution could look like. And then that might be a little more effective in being able to address what had happened, without causing any additional harm. So those are some ideas of situations of when communication can be really tough. Is there anything you want to add to that, Don?
No, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to cruise along here. So the next thing I want to talk about is listening. So listening was that last step in the last slide that we talked about. And listening is how we connect with each other. It's a requirement for being able to take directions or understand concepts, or even to feel. And it absolutely takes practice. And so there's 5 different levels of listening. So one is ignoring, so not really listening at all. The next is pretending to listen, so fake being engaged. And then 3 is selective listening. So listening for what you want to hear, expect to hear, or assume that you'll hear. And then attentive listening. So there's kind of 4 different aspects of attentive listening. So there's autobiographic, which you're listening with the intent of how does what they're saying relate to me. Probing, so asking questions like interviewing, giving advice, so feeling you know what is best. Or interpret, so repeating within your context without awareness of theirs. And then empathic listening is that last one that we're all kind of trying to aim for, is active listening with the intent to truly understand what they have to say. So common phrase for that is listening to understand, not to respond. And so I'm curious, after knowing those different definitions, of what level of listening do you think you honestly engage in throughout the day? So that can be personally or work as well. And this is all anonymous, so no one will know what you selected. I think this is definitely important, of like that self-awareness piece of being able to be honest with yourself, and learn more about how can I be a better listener. Okay, so it seems like 43% are saying selective listening and 40% are reporting attentive listening. Okay, so I'll give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, great. So the most dominant one was selective listening. So, listening for what you want to hear, expect to hear, or assume that you'll hear. Absolutely, that makes sense. A lot of people engage in that as well. So I kind of want you all to think about how that applies to healthy relationships, and how that might apply to your work as well. Okay, cool. So lastly, for my section, we'll kind of talk about, and I want to acknowledge and be really real about how, the world is all experiencing a global pandemic in different ways, and also a lot of similar ways too. And how, physical isolation at home can put a strain on relationships. There have been a lot of different articles I linked to at the bottom of the slide here if you want to explore that more, if that's really relevant for your life. But I do want to do this poll of how can physical isolation at home strain relationships. So there's a lot of different ways that this can show up. Not being able to see other people, not being able to have clear markers of like working versus home life, or not being able to engage in the same hobbies or outlets, or like simply not being used to being around each other so much. That can be an adjustment as well. So I'll give a couple of seconds to talk about that, or for you all to submit your responses to the poll. So it seems like a lot of people are saying not being able to see other people, like friends or family. And then also not being able to have healthy distance, whether that's time-wise, space-wise, or emotionally. Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. And share the results. So those are different things. So just some tips of being able to implement what we've talked about today about healthy relationships in our current context of, setting schedules and routines or expectations, and that, those things might shift. The dynamic that people have been able to, engage with before COVID might be different now. After COVID, there might be different needs. There might be different things to make adjustments for. Maybe setting aside alone time, just saying, every Friday at this time, I'm going to have some Brene time, which is my name, or like my own time, just to detox, and just so that person is aware of that. Or even designating certain times to have quality time together. Maybe I've seen a lot of different like ideas of, how to have a date indoors, or how to have a fun like romantic date inside. So those are some things to think about as well, or communicating early, talking with each other, knowing when to back away from a certain situation. planning to do something that brings you joy and relaxation every day. Connect with other people not in the house, whether it's FaceTime, online games, or, socially distant walk or different things like that. And then I also included links for the self-care plan and emotional safety planning as well. So I'll add that to the chat if people are interested in learning more about that. And then there's also some things in the chat. I've seen a ton of tension, especially in homes where COVID belief systems are different. Mask versus no mask debate. Yeah, absolutely. Homes in general, whether you live with your family right now or you have roommates and you just have differing opinions on those things, that can absolutely create a lot of tension and conflict. And then no support that is healthy otherwise. And then I agree, especially where one person is very serious about following the rules, mandates, and the other person not so much. Yeah, when there's a misalignment with those things, that can definitely cause some issues as well of not being able to come to that compromise or agreement, and that being really difficult. I'm going to add these links. Sorry, I got distracted. But being able to create a self-care plan can be really helpful, and then having these emotional safety planning as well. Safety planning. And then I also included another link from Love is Respect about their healthy relationships quiz, and that can help you maybe assess, I'm not sure if my relationship's healthy right now or not. That can help you give some more insight on that as well. Okay, so now I'm officially going to turn it over to Dawn to discuss how Alexandra House implements healthy relationship programming and prevention, or curriculum as primary prevention, and anything else that she wants to add.
Thank you. So my work with Alexandra House as a youth service coordinator, I've been working with youth services for 15 years. Our program is very wide. When I started 15 years ago, it was myself. We currently have 3 advocates who work in the schools as well as myself. So we do have a very broad and comprehensive program that has been built over years. So it's not something that, was quick and immediate. It did take time to make it all come together. But I wanted to kind of share what our program looks like and what is some possibilities or potential. Some of you may be doing this already. Some of you may be looking into how can I get more connected with youth in the community. And again, all of this is a little bit tenuous because of COVID-19 and being able to actually go and do some direct on-site service versus trying to do more virtual programming. We work with over 20 sites within Anoka County. Our county actually has the largest high school district in the state. So we have some very large districts that we deal with thousands of students per high school, and some that are smaller sites with only a few hundred. We also work with alternative schools. And sometimes there is probably some of the higher need kids even, or have more deeper conversations. So when we work within the schools, we try and do support groups. So as we're working with youth and talking with them, maybe they've ended relationships and are trying to figure out, how do I start a healthy one? In some of the conversation we've already had, there was a lot of conversation around guilt and shame and lack of being able to trust someone. So really working with some of those pieces through support groups, setting goals, working on self-esteem, coping skills, really going through a lot of that within support groups. We do classroom presentations. We have multiple different presentations, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And we've again had to change with virtual versus in class. And then we also work with individuals, just doing individual advocacy, having those conversations. Sometimes we may meet with a student once or twice, and that they're good. Others may want multiple meetings for individual advocacy. We are not therapists or counselors, so we do a lot of referral back to support systems within a school, with counselors, with therapists, and getting them connected with other resources. We definitely know we are a visitor in a school as we're doing these things. We are not the be all and end all, but schools often look to us because of our expertise in the area. We also work with the Anoka County Juvenile Corrections. They have 3 sites where juveniles are incarcerated in our county, and some may come from other counties around the state. this is where we mainly get to work with a lot of the male population. And so there is a small female population within that as well. But being able to have conversations with young men who, though they may be perpetrators, may also be victims. And so we're talking a lot about family violence. We're talking about healthy relationships. We're really these are some of the best conversations I feel I have sometimes. These young men are very open to having the conversations and really interested in kind of talking through them and seeing what this looks like. And so being able to have these conversations in a site that isn't a school and still being able to connect with these young men is really important. We often do these in 8-week sessions. In the summer, we were there on a weekly basis, and of course that changed this year. We have some great middle school programming during the summer that's more prevention-based. And we work with local school districts, and we work with local community centers that may have middle school programming going on, really realizing if we can start conversations earlier around boundaries or making healthy choices or consent, that we hope that they can take that into more relationships that they have. We also have an Instagram page. We had youth that were helping us with some of the information on it. We've been trying to keep that going over the summer. And the Instagram page is Alex House MNYS, if anybody is interested. But it's, again, something that we're really trying to, ways to keep students connected. In the classroom presentations that we do, we actually have them go on as a task to our website. And that's one of the things they can look through our site and pull out information. We also run a leadership institute. We've been doing this for the last 3 years, where we have a very small group of youth, usually about 6 to 8, who come together. We do a very intense first week of really learning about dating violence, sexual violence, community violence, all of that wrapped up. And then the second week, they choose a project to work on. And last year, the students literally overtook our Instagram page and created amazing content for over a month. This year, our Leadership Institute will definitely look different. We're going to do just a couple of 1-hour sessions rather than, 6 hours for 5 days a week for 2 weeks. So we just still want to try and engage those youth and hope that once the schools open up again, that we may be able to engage them in other ways. So a little bit more about some of what we're doing in the individual advocacy. We really want to meet the students where they're at. So our support groups don't follow one specific curriculum. We really look at what those youth are dealing with and kind of focus the conversations around that and pull from different curriculums. There's a lot of great stuff out there, but following one specific curriculum, especially for a support group, we found doesn't work as well for us and for our students. So we really like to be able to kind of see where their conversations are at, what they're dealing with right now. It's a great way for youth to be able to connect with each other. It's scary oftentimes, so we try and keep the group closed for the most part once we start it, so that those kids can build a trust and a relationship within that group. So oftentimes, like at one school, I had 3 support groups going. So as we find the need, we continue to fill it at those schools. Most of our high schools, in the 20-some that we're in, do have a support group. Some we just do more individual as well. But really important to be able to kind of meet those students where they're at, help them figure out, where they want to move from here, what things they're looking to figure out more about. In our support group topics, we talk about boundaries, which is a huge piece, and practicing those communication skills. Like Brene was saying, there's just so many conversations. We assume that students know what healthy is. We assume that they know, what's okay or not okay for them. But sometimes they need to have that conversation and actually be given permission. And it sounds a little crazy, but like telling them it's okay. And that, you don't have to accept certain things. We talk a lot around family violence. Many of these youth have grown up in homes where relationships aren't very healthy, but that's the only thing they have to base it on. So helping them sometimes break some of those cycles. They can sometimes see the unhealthiness in a parent's relationship, but have a harder time seeing it in their own. So we use a lot of those power and control wheel pieces with conversations and really kind of work through that. Our classroom presentations, we had to change it up, but usually we go into like a health class, and in some of our school districts, that's 5 presentations in a day, but it's a way to reach those youth. So we, in our classroom presentations, really try and talk about healthy relationships and make it fit for the entire classroom. We talk about consent. We use the consent T video, which again is a way to get them to understand more around consent. And our goal is to really do this presentation and then have them walk out and talk about it during lunch, have more conversations with their friends, or pull that out. Classroom presentations are also a way for a student to self-refer, so that they can meet with us in their schools. And it's a safe way for them to ask to have a conversation with us. And then we have other presentations that we do, like we talked about that relationship spectrum. We do some bystander scenarios out of what's called Green Dot. A lot of our English classes, the kids are reading the book Speak, which goes through sexual violence. So the English teachers invite us in. So that's a lot of the conversations that we have as well. But again, trying to videotape things or put things on YouTube, trying to create classroom presentations that will fit with what the teachers are doing with distance learning. We were able to do survey monkeys after the presentations that we created that were virtual. And we had several responses, which was good. We had hundreds of responses actually from the students. So we were pleasantly surprised. And kids were still able to self-refer. So we were still able to make contact with them, even though it was virtually set up. And so they would give us an email address or a safe telephone number to call to touch base with them. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the things that we use. Earlier in this conversation, I really talked about how do we engage youth that are not feeling like they're in a relationship, or this doesn't relate to me. So how do we get kids engaged in the conversation, whether they are in relationships or not? There's a great resource through the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence called In Their Shoes, and it's a teen version. You may have seen In Her Shoes, but the teen version of In Their Shoes goes through the lives of 6 different teens. It is diverse, it is inclusive. It really helps teens kind of see the barriers and the supports and what can happen within relationships. What I like about this activity is each group that follows one of the teens makes decisions about what their next step will be. So it's not one continuous story. It changes depending upon who the group is. And the group gets very invested as they're going through it. I will tell you, we were at an alternative school this year and I was a little iffy. Several of the groups were more largely male. And at the beginning, they were kind of, hemming and hawing. They didn't want to do this. And why do we have to do this? And by the end, they had more to say about what was going on with the person who they had to follow. They got very engaged in it and very invested in it. So it is a great learning tool to get people involved or engaged in the conversation and what can happen. So I really encourage that. If it's something, we're actually going to try that with our Leadership Institute kids next week and try and do it virtually. See if we can make it work that way. For anybody who's knows about bystander intervention and direct distract delegate, it's something that came out of the Green Dot. And I think it's now called altruistic. The website is listed below. Green Dot is, the direct distract delegate is a great way, whether you're working with middle school kids, whether you're working with adults. I've done this in community programs and within schools to really empower a bystander. If you see certain things going on, what are some options? And I think that sometimes we just tell people, okay, just stop doing that, or don't do that, or just go in directly. But it really gives them a way to think about how else could I step in? And I have seen some of these situations and I was never comfortable doing, directly intervening. So how could I do a distraction or a delegate? And then you have the kids practice. It actually works really wonderful. Having those conversations. And again, it gives them a skill and a tool to realize that they can be part of the solution. We really kind of encourage them that doing nothing means that you're agreeing with what you see going on. And so really encourage them to take some step that will help, especially now with all the violence going on, the different things that people are experiencing or that we're just seeing more on TV, the community violence. It oftentimes, we worked with a group of middle school kids the other day, and it was really interesting for them when they talked about delegating, delegating to a police officer was not an option for them. So let's come up with some other options. And they were really good about finding those and figuring out what worked for what they felt okay with. And then we talked earlier about the relationship spectrum. One of my favorite times using this was we actually did it with a confirmation class where we had kids and parents together putting the words on that spectrum. And you could see lots of conversations going on with that group as the more we continue to do that activity. So again, I think all of these activities are more based on a large group and engaging anyone rather than specifically talking to people who are in unhealthy or abusive relationships. And I think that in order to keep this conversation going and to move things forward, it's really important to have those conversations. So these are some ways to do that.
Great. There's a question from Amy saying, love to hear all the education for teens to stop the cycle early. I'm curious why there seems to be a drop off in resources and support for adult women coming out of abusive relationships, and the resources that are offered to them focus on helping or fixing the trauma in the woman and moving on, and less support for fighting back for her rights and correcting the things or life taken from her during the abuse.
You know, Amy, I completely understand what you're saying. It is hard to help that person take those next steps or decide where they're going to go with what happened to them. And I think that's a big part of listening to where someone's at and helping to support them as they make the choices, rather than moving it on a path that we think they should go on. You know, if they are looking at, you know, fighting back or wanting to speak out or wanting to pursue legal options, or not wanting to pursue legal options, that we are supporting them on the path, but at least letting them know, you know, and helping them along that path. There may be things they never thought of that are open to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say there are a lot of other resources, and it's included in the next few slides, that are specifically for adult women coming out of abusive relationships too. We are talking a little bit more about like prevention, so that's why we're talking more about teens in this particular kind of section of the webinar. But we'll definitely have a lot of resources for you to explore more about support for adult women. And then also our healing panel from last week kind of gets at a lot of the things that you mentioned in your message as well. So thank you for pointing that out.
Just wanted to talk some about working with parents. And we know, you know, that sometimes it can be frustrating to try and get parents on board. I remember talking to someone who said, you know, they go to a parent meeting on hockey and 300 parents show up, and then they had a drug awareness meeting the next night and had 4. So it's like, how do you engage or get parents to see that this is part of a conversation they should be part of? What's hard is that, you know, 81% of parents don't think that dating violence is an issue. They don't even realize that it's going on. And then 82% said they wouldn't even know what the signs to look for were. So I think, you know, anytime you are able to connect with parents, like I said, it was interesting to see when we did that confirmation class and worked with the parents, we got to have the parents for a half an hour first before the youth were brought in. So we got to have some very open conversation with them and really talk about it. So I think that just being able to have that conversation is really important. So anytime you can create that possibility or an option is really important. Some of the warning signs we talk about can also be part of teenage angst. So it's hard to know, is this just my teenager being a teenager, or is this an unhealthy relationship? But we talk about things like, you know, being more secretive and distancing, quitting clubs and activities they enjoy, being very attached to their phone and their dating partner, having to respond immediately, lots of mood changes and personality. Sometimes you can see the power dynamics depending upon the age of one partner versus the other. There could be a change in things like eating habits and what clothes they wear. But again, it's hard to differentiate teenage angst from sometimes these unhealthy or abusive relationships. So it is important to kind of dig deeper in talking with your child. One of the things we see a lot of is usually less friend contact too, is a big one. I am a big believer in teachable moments, and to realize that having a conversation with your teen can't just sit down and say, okay, today we're going to talk about relationships and dating. And, it's more listening to what they're talking about. Are they commenting on a friend's relationship? And can you start to have that conversation with them then about, how would you want to be treated, or what would you have done differently? Maybe you see something on a TV show that you're watching together and you start to have that conversation around healthy relationships. Maybe there's something that's coming up in the news that you're seeing. So it's really having those conversations as things come up and bringing them up along the way. I think those are sometimes when you're going to have some of the more engaging conversations. And it's hard for a parent to think that their child is going to talk to someone else about an unhealthy relationship or some of those things. So really making sure that you allow your child to know that it is okay to talk to a different relative or a different trusted adult around those conversations if they don't feel like they can talk to you. The best scenario would be if they talk to you, but that doesn't always happen. And so I also think, helping them build that support system of people. We safety plan a lot with youth, right? If you're drinking at a party, I want you to promise to call me and to, not get in a car with someone. But we often don't talk about if you are in a violent situation, whether it's in a dating relationship, whether it's at a party, whether you're at a community event and violence begins to happen, we don't always safety plan with them in that way. If you're talking to me on the phone and you don't want your friends to know that you really want me to come pick you up, it's okay to say a certain word in the conversation and we'll make this happen. Giving them, the safety to be able to talk with you and not judge. And then one of the biggest pieces, we had a youth council for quite a while, and the youth council kids wanted to give their ideas of what that could look like, as far as, what parents should be looking for. And one of the things that they encouraged parents was, don't say how much you love their new dating partner, because if their dating partner is abusive, they may, a parent saying, oh, you're so lucky to be dating so-and-so, that it starts to put a lot of judgment on that relationship. It's great if you like their dating partner, but being careful not to overly push them onto this person or keep them. But on the flip side, the teens were also saying, if you immediately say, I don't like that person, he's not good, he or she isn't good for you, they shouldn't be around you, that can also push them into that relationship to prove a parent wrong. So again, there's no, golden rule, but the teens were saying just really try to keep judgment down. The teens also said, invite their dating partners over. Have them come to dinner or meet on the weekend or come hang out at the house and do something. Get that teen involved in some of your family stuff so that you can see how things are connected, how they're being treated and treating each other, so that the relationship doesn't become so secretive. And one of the big ones they encouraged was talk to their friends. Ask their friends, what do you think, how do you think this relationship is going? What do you think is going well? What do you think could be improved on? They said their friends know a lot and will often share with the parents. So that was just some of the suggestions from the youth council. So I think the biggest part is, again, just trying to have those conversations.
Thank you, Dawn. There were a few things in the chat about that of how this is great advice, not just for teens. and how it's important to incorporate the context and the different relationships that parents have, and what we can do differently to educate and support the parents too. Um, and then again, added some resources. So I know we are kind of past 11:30 a little bit, so no worries if you have to go. In the chat, I added a lot of different links. When you exit out of the webinar, you will be directed to a survey. If you could fill that out, that would be really helpful for us. And then again, you can email me. I put my email in the chat for a certificate of attendance. And then some other links to register for August webinars, resource hubs, and some more culturally specific power and control wheels. So a lot of that will be available here. So this is a slide that kind of talks about all the different resources that Women's Advocates has compiled. And then these are specific resources to continue learning about healthy relationships. So lots of stuff, different things for parents, different things for educators, some of the other things that we mentioned here as well. And all the other links that we mentioned will be on the slides when I send them out too. So we'll stick around for a few minutes if people still have any remaining questions or anything that they'd like to ask about. These are the webinars, the 4 that are going to happen next month. So please join us for those. And I just want to thank you all so much for being here. Here's our contact information. Here's Dawn's contact information. Definitely visit our respective websites. Follow us on social media to stay up to date on different things. Add our crisis lines to your phones. And let us know if you have any remaining questions. But thank you so much for being here. And thank you for your questions. There is a question from Amy. Do you think there will be a time or a shift in the future where legal systems will recognize and respect all forms of abuse, not just physical, since the current landscape paints psychological abuse is just too hard to prove? I think that a lot of advocates are pushing for that. They are trying to talk more about how as we learn more about what abuse really is and how it can manifest, trying to incorporate that into the legal system as well, and educating people who are making those decisions. So whether that's judges, attorneys, guardian ad litems, other people in that realm, as there's more awareness with them, that might snowball into effects of people understanding that, abuse is not just physical, and there's other ways that we can help understand what has happened to a person, because we even know sometimes there isn't sufficient evidence for things that are physical too. So I think that that's definitely something that the legal system needs to work on to truly support and center survivors and be able to, provide justice and provide protection for them too. And I know advocates have worked really hard of how, they're having to be able to frame different things that have happened in order to get an order for protection or a DANCO or different things to talk about, real harm has been caused. So I'm optimistic and hopeful that there will be a time and a shift that legal systems will recognize and respect it. Although I do think it will take a lot of awareness and a lot more time and education. But I don't think it's unrealistic, but also like the first marital rape law didn't come out until a couple decades ago. So just keeping that in mind too, of as far as how progress lies. But I think there has been an increasing awareness of things like gaslighting and emotional abuse, that people are recognizing it more as valid. And so hopefully it'll continue in that direction. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add, Dawn.
Yeah, I think, our legal system, I think part of it is continuing to educate our legal system as well. Trying to work with judges and prosecutors and that kind of thing around some of this other types of violence as well. Some are much more open to talking about more of the psychological abuse and the verbal abuse versus the physical. So I think that it's working, on some of that, working with policy changes as well. We are slowly, but I will say in working with, women, men, anyone who is going through this, that we're seeing, a lot of their frustration is they didn't even let me talk about this, or, they said that wasn't as serious, or so they, really wanting their voices to be heard, that it is more than physical. So we know, it's small steps, but trying to work for that change and not giving up on it. I really would like to see some of that more incorporated. especially with orders for protection, some of that, which I do think some of it is being taken into account, but it usually has to have a physical content with it first.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you. I do see a few things. Someone saying, can we work toward having evening webinars? Yeah, definitely add that to the feedback form, and we'll kind of get a tally of making it more accessible for other people who might be able to attend at different times that aren't during the work day, or maybe your work schedule is different than the typical 9 to 5, or you're in a different time zone. So thank you for that. I hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday. If you have any questions, again, you can email either of us with any questions or concerns. Before the end of the day, you'll get an email from me with all the links to the PDFs and everything. It just takes a moment to get the recording up on YouTube. But thank you again, and thank you so much to Dawn for sharing your experience and all the information. It was really wonderful to have you.
Thanks for creating the opportunity to be able to share what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people benefited from hearing more about the amazing work that you're doing, and hopefully it can spread beyond Anoka County. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.